This video is looking at the resurrection of Jesus. It's obviously a foundation, if not the foundation, of Christianity. It's got general application in terms of understanding the resurrection as an introduction and overview, although it does have some specific focus on the Eduqas A-level RS Christianity paper. Before we look at the resurrection, it's worth having a quick look at the crucifixion. This is in the realms here of very simple historical narrative. There's nothing strange at all about crucifixion in first century Palestine. It was pretty routine for the Romans. It was the way they dealt with anybody who they considered to be in some way troublesome. And to put Jesus' crucifixion in context, in 4 BC, the Roman general Varus crucified 2,000 Jews. If we look in the account of Jesus' crucifixion, we've got 3 of them crucified together, and the other 2 are described as laestes, that's the Greek word, and the English translation of that is bandit, brigand, and it's a term used by the establishment of the Jewish revolutionaries, the Zealots. It's also important as we look at the crucifixion of Jesus to establish that we are starting our exploration of the resurrection with a dead Jesus. You find the hypothesis presented from some quarters that Jesus had maybe just simply passed out and then was revived in the cool of the tomb, and so it wasn't a resurrection, he just wasn't dead. If you look at the accounts of the punishments inflicted on Jesus before he was nailed to the cross, that was sufficient to kill some men. There's just no way that even if Jesus had somehow not been dead when he was put in the tomb, there's no way that the battered, bruised, damaged, half-dead man who then staggered out of the tomb could possibly persuade anybody that he was in fact some resurrected Son of God, the Messiah. So we need to look at Jesus as somebody who'd actually died. So we're looking at a fully human death on the cross. Now that's got implications for the Trinity. There was an early church heresy that God was not crucified. This is the idea that God cannot suffer. And there were a number of different theories presented to account for this. Jesus, as in God incarnate, was substituted for someone else before the actual crucifixion, so it wasn't Jesus who was nailed to the cross, it was someone else. Another aspect of this would be that the God part of Jesus had departed before the crucifixion, so therefore it was only the human Jesus that was crucified. The first century AD, the idea of a crucified Messiah, that would have just been an oxymoron. We can only put those 2 words together comfortably because of Christian theology. The crucifixion was a very clear statement that the Romans and the Jewish religious establishment had won, and so therefore this messianic pretender had been ignominiously crushed using the ultimate in shameful deaths. That should have been the end of the story. The fact that it isn't the end of the story is what we are looking at. So now to move to the main focus of this, which is the resurrection. We're going to look at particular aspects of this. We're going to look at Bultmann and Wright as examples of different positions on the resurrection. We're going to have a quick dip into some of the implications, some of the ways that the resurrection then can feed into understandings of different aspects of Christian doctrine. And we're going to look at the nature of the resurrected body and the historical reliability of the resurrection. These are just overview, so we're not looking in much detail at any of these. Starting point for this, though, is that the resurrection event, and I'll use that term rather than talking about the resurrection. So the resurrection event is absolutely central to Christianity, whatever it is, and that's what we are looking at here. Whatever it is central. And different sections of Christianity then have different understandings of this resurrection event. That's what we're looking at, and we're going to explore, just dip into Wright and Bultmann to show how you can have the resurrection event as central, but then have quite significantly different understandings of what that means. So we're looking at Wright, N.T. Wright, modern contemporary theologian. And the important thing for Wright is that he accepts the possibility of miracles. That's a starting point. That's one of his axioms. Miracles are possible. He also starts with the idea that Jesus was fully human man. So we're looking Trinitarian stuff here. He's 100% man, but he's also 100% God, fully humanly dead after the crucifixion. And then Wright's position is that 3 days in the tomb and Jesus was then resurrected. What Wright means by this is he came alive again bodily, but somehow transformed, and then after 40 days like this, he then left Earth in an embodied form. Bultmann we're going to use as an example of a modernist position. By modernist, really, we're looking at this developed somewhere in the middle to late 19th century. And very importantly, an axiom of this position is a rejection of the possibility of miracles. If you've got no miraculous, therefore the resurrection has got to be interpreted some way other than as a historical event. If your axiom says there are no miracles, the resurrection cannot be a historical event. So you're looking then at what would it be? Metaphorically, interpreted symbolically, existentially. You've got to look at some way of engaging with the resurrection event which doesn't require a bodily resurrection. Now, without the resurrection, Jesus fits within Jewish patterns of operation, really. You've got those Jewish reforming prophets that we read about in the Old Testament. Look at the book of Amos. You can look into the New Testament for reforming prophet characters. John the Baptist is described there. So Jesus would have fitted perfectly within that model. He also fits in the pattern of failed messiahs. There's no shortage of these. A couple of examples: Judas the Galilean, he was 6 AD. Simon Bar Kokhba, 135 AD. So being a messiah wasn't that special, and failing as a messiah, or apparently failing as a messiah, is also not that unusual. Whether the resurrection is a historical event or not, it's difficult to interpret the New Testament as saying other than it is a historical event, and it's the central event which requires a completely new way of looking at everything. So plain reading of the New Testament would deliver that. In the Bible, we find the resurrection included in all 4 Gospels, and it comes unsurprisingly at the end, and the subtle differences in the way that's presented. And so the major question then would be, how significant are those differences in the way that the gospel writers include the account of the gospel? And a major question that's got to be answered is what it was, how this resurrection event transformed the followers of Jesus from becoming just the scattered followers of a failed Messiah to be then becoming hugely confident people who travelled around telling everybody that Jesus was the Messiah. That has to be accounted for, and the resurrection event is clearly what produced that shift. And so we need to look at what sort of resurrection event could produce that change in the followers. The resurrection points us to a number of different aspects of Christian belief, Christian doctrine, Christian practice. So the resurrection leads us to look at the question of the miraculous, the whole question of whether miracles can be historical. We've got religious experience. We've got St. Paul meeting the risen Christ on the road to Damascus. What did that mean? What's going on there? We've got some quite important concepts, doctrinal concepts like the atonement. Festivals, Easter is clearly focused on the death and resurrection of Jesus. And then on a weekly basis, or in fact daily for some Christians, you've got the idea of the Eucharist. Jesus' death and resurrection is a very central concept within the Eucharist, and it also leads us into looking at the nature of God in the Trinity. So we'll start then with looking at N.T. Wright. So looking at these two contrasting theologians, we'll look at Wright and Bultmann. And so we'll start with contemporary theologian, born in 1948, still around, still functioning, New Testament scholar, Church of England scholar. He was Bishop of Durham for a time, a prolific writer. You can find lots of Tom Wright on YouTube. Very important here is the axioms that these theologians start with. And an axiom for Wright is that miracles are possible, that what is normally termed the miraculous, that which defies our normal scientific understanding, is possible. That doesn't mean to say he's going to believe absolutely anything, any claimed miracle. He doesn't just accept it. But likewise, he's not going to reject it out of hand simply because it is a miracle. So what Wright's got to do then is he's got an axiom which says miracles are possible, and he then has to look at the evidence for this specific miracle, the resurrection, as in empty tomb. Is there enough evidence to accept it as a historical event? It's quite important to realise here the only evidence for this is historical. There's no scientific evidence which can be brought to bear. Science cannot tell us that miracles cannot happen. That's another question. So what Wright does is he explores the concept of death and the afterlife in Greek and Hebrew thought, and then looks at how this Christian understanding of Jesus' resurrection fits with those ideas. They were the two main strands of thought which were present in Palestine at the time. So you've got the Greek ideas, where there's no concept at all of bodily resurrection. For Plato, Plato has this very strict dualist concept. You've got the soul imprisoned in the body, the physical body, and at death the soul, this immaterial, eternal soul, and after death the soul is liberated and it then can have an independent existence. But it's an internal soul, it's not embodied. Quite a different idea to bodily resurrection that you find in Christian thought. It's also worth, as an aside here, as a huge amount of very Greek thinking has in fact permeated Christianity. So a lot of Christianity is far more Platonic and Greek than it is Hebraic. Now, Hebrew thought, you need to be careful as you're looking at the Old Testament. You've got 1,000+ years of development in the Old Testament. By the time of Jesus, there are concepts then of bodily resurrection of some form. And in fact, you can see this. It's actually explicit within the Gospels, where you've got the Sadducees who reject completely bodily resurrection, the Pharisees who accept it. So there's discussion going on internally within Judaism on questions of the resurrection. Now, a slightly quirky idea from Wright, which is quite important and brings out something about Jesus' resurrection, is his idea of life after death. So the idea here is that the person dies, they then go into life after death, and that seems to be some sort of non-embodied form. It's a sort of waiting period. Bodily resurrection is what happens after this. So Wright's looking at this in terms of a two-stage process: life after death, and then the resurrection, the bodily resurrection, as life after death. Move now to Bultmann then. Bultmann, towering theological figure, really very significant in the 20th century in biblical studies and how it was interpreted. Now, what he's proposing is an existentialist interpretation of the New Testament. Axioms, again, very important. Now, the starting point for Bultmann's project, which is known as demythologization, is a complete rejection of miracles. He makes this statement about modern life. So he'd be writing here in Germany in the middle of the 20th century. We cannot use electric lights and radios and, in the event of illness, avail ourselves of modern medical and clinical means and at the same time believe in the spirit and wonder world of the New Testament. Obviously he wrote that in German, but we're working in English. Now, of course, that's an assertion, really, because there's loads of people around who do use electric lights and radios, and in fact, these days, iPhones, and have vastly more sophisticated modern medical facilities available than Bultmann could have known, but at the same time, quite happily accept the concept of the miraculous. But that's Bultmann's starting point. It's an axiom. It's not something that is argued. Now, Bultmann's project of demythologization is one which says that you read the New Testament and the Old Testament, and they are just different worlds. They don't understand things the same as us. There's lots of mythical expression there, and that doesn't fit with modern life, so therefore we've got to get rid of it. And the way that Bultmann does this is he doesn't take the line which says we have to reinterpret, so therefore you've got this resurrection, you've got these miracles of Jesus, and you've then got to work out, okay, what could you have seen? You time travel back, you get out your phone and you video, what would we see? Now, Bultmann takes a different line here, which is the existentialist approach, which says actually he's not bothered about that. That's not a question which he even remotely is interested in. What Bultmann wants to focus on is the meaning of that resurrection event. As far as he's concerned, the fact is trivial. That's an important point here, that if you did do your time travel back, you video, you come back and you say, oh yeah, okay, Jesus did actually feed the 5,000. Oh yeah, Jesus did actually rise from the dead. Here we've got a video of him emerging from the tomb. There could be a response to that as well. Okay, so what? It's the meaning that is of prime importance. And so what Bultmann wants to do is focus purely on the meaning. And he's got no interest at all in the historical event. And what Bultmann wants to focus on is what is termed the kerygma, the proclamation. This is what the church presented, the early church presented. And it's in the kerygma that Jesus is risen from the dead. And the historical Jesus is of little significance. Let's just do a quick digression into the kerygma. There's a number of these, their lists of what the message of the apostles, the message of that early followers of Jesus, what was the message that was presented in that time immediately after Jesus' execution and the resurrection event. What was it that they talked about? Bultmann's got a list. I'm going to use C.H. Dodd, British theologian who comes a bit later than Bultmann. I'm going to use his list, but all these lists have got quite a large overlap. And so the idea is that the kerygma, the message, every time you read some sermon or letter or presentation of the early church, what do you get? And you get this idea that there's some sort of age of fulfillment is now here, the latter days. If you read the Old Testament, you've got references to these. And this has taken place. The significance here is it's about birth, life, ministry, death and resurrection of Jesus. You've got this idea that the resurrection event, through that Jesus has been exalted at the right hand of God as this messianic head of the new Israel. You've got Trinitarian ideas there. And then you've got the Holy Spirit is the empowering of God in the church, and it's a sign then of Christ's victory, his glory, his power. And then there's this messianic age will finally wrap everything up in the return of Christ. And then when that's presented, either in its totality or different parts of it, then the next one is this appeal to the people who are hearing or reading the kerygma, engaging, seeing the kerygma. An appeal is then made that they should repent. There's an offer of forgiveness. The Holy Spirit will fill them, and salvation. So back to Bultmann again. The process Bultmann is thinking of here is the people. So we're looking at that period immediately after the resurrection, looking at that Acts of the Apostles period. And people encounter the kerygma. They will encounter it in sermons from the apostles. They'll encounter it in just the way they see the early Christians functioning as they lived together, as they shared possessions, as they helped the poor. So they encounter the kerygma. The next step is that they recognize something within the kerygma which is meaningful to them. And the important thing here is this is probably not them sitting and working things out and looking at empirical evidence and laying stuff out in some logical argument. This is at the rather gut level. This is where we come into the existentialist bit of this. And as they encounter the kerygma, they are moved in some way by what they've encountered, and then they make that leap of faith and respond existentially to the risen Christ which is what they respond to, that's within the kerygma. They see the risen Christ, they experience the risen Christ, they respond to the risen Christ that they've encountered in the word and deed of these early Christians. And so the risen Christ is encountered existentially, in contrast to intellectually worked out from the evidence. The historical Jesus, then, if you think about it, is, well, at best just irrelevant, but at worst may actually get in the way of somebody making that leap of faith. If they get hung up on questions about, oh, what would we see if we time travelled back, potentially means that they're going to miss the meaning, the profound meaning of the resurrection event, and then fail to respond to it. A couple of lengthy quotes here from Bultmann. Just stop the video and read those. But they're basically, that's the rooting what I've just been talking about there in Bultmann. Okay, let's look then at the resurrection body of Jesus and the implications for understanding death, the soul, and the afterlife. There's lots of images of the resurrection body of Jesus, and I chose that one because it looks very clearly embodied. That looks like an ordinary body, but not quite. There's a slight sort of glowy light aspect to it. It's also noticeable, it doesn't seem to have any marks in his hands, but anyway, I found lots of depictions. It'd be quite interesting to just have a look, do a bit of Google Images, resurrection body of Jesus, and look at how different people have chosen to present the body. One of the things that's certain as you read the gospel accounts is that the nature of the resurrection body of Jesus, you can't pin it down exactly, because you've got a presentation of Jesus as having sufficiently normal physicality. Mary thought he was the gardener. That's probably what's being depicted in the image in that opening slide. And so she thinks he's the gardener, has a conversation with him, so he's clearly just ordinarily embodied enough for that. There's the account at the end of John where he meets the disciples on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and he's made them some fish, so he's clearly embodied enough that he can break the bread and fish. Doesn't actually say explicitly that he ate it, but he can certainly pick the stuff up and break it. But it's also clear that those gospel accounts are describing someone who does not have normal physicality, because there's several references to him just appearing in a locked room. So he just somehow materializes in the middle of the room. He enters through walls and locked doors. So paradoxes here and uncertainty as to what we are dealing with. St. Paul explores the idea of the resurrection of the body, very particularly in his letter to the church at Corinth. That's chapter 15. In this, he lists the appearances of the risen Jesus, and quite interestingly, he includes in this his own encounter along with those to the disciples, without making any distinction between them. The appearances to the disciples were in a period very shortly after the crucifixion and resurrection event, and this appearance to Paul, Saul as he then was, would have been at least a decade after that. Paul then works with this idea of a spiritual body. It's quite complicated. He's working with different analogies. He presents the idea of seeds sown with a physical body, raised with a spiritual body. The main thing there, he's looking at a difference and a continuity. The main thing we can pull out from that is that he's rejecting two concepts. One of them is this Greek concept of a purely spiritual soul that exists in disembodied form, and the other concept he rejects is just the straightforward physicality of the body that we have now. So he's presenting the idea that this resurrection body is both the same but also different to what we have now. The main idea that he's presenting is that it is in some way embodied. The final slides then are the section of 1 Corinthians 15, which is relevant, and then the account of the resurrection from the Gospel of John, chapters 20 and 21.